Welcome to Game Theorem, where we have serious discussions about absurd entertainment.
I'm Kyle.
I'm Kira.
So, Kira, before we got into today's episode, I felt it would only be right if I explained some of my background.
Yeah, for the listeners, I already know your background.
Well, I'm from Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. I am what you might call a Southerner. And if you've listened to any of our episodes in the past, you know that naturally that means I'm also progressive.
Yeah, those two things usually don't go together.
Well, how did this happen? Well, the answer is I woke up.
Yeah.
However, the topic we want to talk about today, death of the author.
Mm-hmm.
It's a concept that I've cared about for a long time before I even knew what it was called. I cared about it back when I was doing a whole bunch of analysis on zombies and whatnot, back in my early days on the internet. But a lot of progressive people might not feel the same way I feel about it. I might have a bit more of a controversial take on it.
Mm-hmm. But you know I agree with your take on it.
I mean, sure, because I've told you how I feel about it, so I may have kind of tainted you. So if it wasn't for me, I think you might feel like how most progressives do, especially now with the Me Too movement. This death of the author has come up in the conversation a lot more than it used to back when I was an advocate for it.
Yeah, but I feel like I had the same sort of feelings, like a strong opinion on it myself before I even knew what it was as well, like with certain franchises.
Okay, so why don't we get into it then?
Mm-hmm. All right.
So first we need to define what death of the author is.
Yes.
Do you want to give a whack at it?
Sure. Death of the author is basically saying that a work is completely separate from the author or artist or whatever that made it. And therefore, it's basically treating the work as if the author or artist is dead and just taking the work on its own merits by itself.
Like the work has literally, or the art has outlived the author.
Mm-hmm.
Traditionally, it's been used with literary art, like books and whatnot.
Mm-hmm, which is why it's called Death of the Author and not like artist or anything else.
Yeah. Now, that might be a bit narrow. A lot of people are trying to apply it to other things, which I think is understandable.
Mm-hmm, that's definitely true, as our definition of media has, exploded since books,
Exactly. Now, another term I think that we need to define that's related to death of the author is the word canon.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you describe that?
That's basically what you consider truth in the universe within the fictional universe.
Right, but the term originates from biblical canon.
Oh, really?
Yeah, religious context. What was canon was determining what was right in the eyes of religion.
Oh, great.
So
okay.
the Nicaea Council, the Council of Nicaea in Christianity, they decided what was canon in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And today, depending on what religion you have, is what you accept as being canon or not canon. So even in religious significance, it's a contentious issue. So I feel like when you're talking about the term in relation to fictional media, it's really not surprising that people have different definitions of it.
Yeah, that's true.
But basically, it's about saying, when you're talking about canon, you're basically saying what counts as being part of the story. Mm-hmm. Because the lines between official and unofficial or fan created aren't always so distinct.
Yeah, it gets really blurry, especially with fan works and fan fiction and that kind of thing.
Well, not necessarily, but there are some examples that are more blurry about whether it is fan or not.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, when it comes to people that argue about death of the author, because not everyone agrees that it's a good idea,
Mm-hmm.
But people that are pro-death, they often argue that the art has outlived the author, even problematically so.
Yeah,
so
even to that point.
You could have an author who is very problematic and does a lot of bad things in their life, but is still able to write good art.
Mm-hmm. I see what you mean.
Or not just write, but make good art.
Yes. And people who are pro-death of the author would say that...
That was pro-death.
Yeah. Oh, they would say that that even though the author did those bad things, that their art still can be appreciated for what it was,
Right, that it's not inherently tainted.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas anti-death people would often argue that the perspectives of the authors bury themselves in their art.
Basically saying, like, because they did all those horrible things, it's bound to come up in their art as, you know, a viewpoint.
Right, saying that people's viewpoints affect everything. They're a lens through which their perspective goes through, and the art will go through that perspective, that lens as well, and inherently be tainted.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So pro-death often equals anti-canon, and anti-death often equals pro-canon. So basically, if you're pro-death of the author and you think that the author and the artist should be separated, then you're going to probably be against the idea of canon. You're going to think art stands on its own, that the author can't decide what is and isn't art.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
Whereas the opposite's true. If you're against death of the author, then that means that you think the author can decide how their work goes and how like whether something is or isn't canon. That's not how it always happens, but these things tend to be correlated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's many different domains in which where death of the author can or some people would argue cannot apply. Mm-hmm. And it depends on exactly what the author is. We've been using kind of vague terms, but this goes with all art, right?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Like music artists and people write books, and also people who make games and
movies,
yes,
shows, anime,
yes,
anything. Mm-hmm. So like authors, like the literal author, just like an individual person. Sure. It doesn't really even matter what they're making. Just you have a person and they make something, and some people would claim, oh, well, death of the author, that's the author, right? Mm-hmm. And that they would either say that they can or cannot decide how that work goes. They can't just claim something. Mm-hmm. But then you have the sticky issue with comedians these days.
Oh, yes.
Like, I didn't even use comedians in my arguments back when I was younger, talking about death of the author.
Yeah.
I mean, I may have gotten more progressive as I grew up, but death of the author is one thing that I still have a particular opinion about. Mm-hmm. But with comedians, there's a lot of people that are arguing with comedians these days ever since the Me Too movement came out, right?
Yeah, and it's like, because they're comedians and because they make jokes and that's like very personal to them, and they're the ones that write their own material a lot of the time, that their crimes and things that they've done lends itself into their comedy sets or whatever you want to call it.
Right, because a lot of comedians recently have been discovered to actually be assaulters, abusers. I guess we should have given a kind of some type of trigger warning before this episode. Mm-hmm. Okay, warning right now. No spoilers, really. Maybe a little. I don't know, but yeah, there will be some talk of some. What's the appropriate word?
I don't know.
Assault against women.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some have come out as basically rapists. Mm-hmm. And therefore, some people argue that, no, you can't separate the art because you can look back at some of the jokes they made and see how terrible they are now with context.
Because...
What?
Because they might have made jokes about women or seen taking women or tricking women as a joke.
Exactly. So that's an important thing to consider on the anti-death side. Mm-hmm. Now, we have to also consider that it's no longer just individual authors in this day and age. There's companies, right? Yeah,
there are companies that are behind works like games and other stuff.
Games and other stuff, yes.
Movies, TV shows.
Art.
Yes.
And some of those companies are huge corporations.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit more murky to define death of the author when just one person has a problematic thing, but everyone else is fine.
Yeah, and because of how big some works have become, like movies and stuff require whole huge teams and games require like whole production companies. Like one person from that company doing something does not equate to the whole work. Usually being...
Well, some people would argue otherwise. Some people would argue if the person in charge has a problematic take, then you should too. Or you should have a problem with that art.
Yeah, I suppose.
Okay, well, we've danced around the issue enough. I think we should tell our take, our perspectives, right? Mm-hmm. We've kind of laid out the field and what the debate that's currently going on now. Mm-hmm. So I guess if it's all right if I take this.
Yeah.
Okay, so our take on Death of the Author. I believe, kind of controversially, that Death of the Author is valid, but I do have some stipulations. First, we need to separate financial support from artistic quality.
Yeah, that's true.
Like, you can choose to not ethically support something, but it still be good art. And that's really a good thing. So, like, if there's some piece of art, some new movie that's coming out, right? But you've heard about some really unethical practices behind the scenes in making that movie, right? Maybe there was like a rapist involved. Maybe there was just some real like overworking of the employees and really whipping them, working 20-hour days, right?
Yeah, I've even heard about animal abuse in certain movies.
Yeah, that happens sometimes. I don't know how often, but sometimes surely. So whenever that happens, you might be like, whoa, I don't want to support that movie. And that is really a good thing you're doing, a sacrifice, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean the movie's bad.
Yes, and you're choosing not to financially support it because of your own personal ideals, but that doesn't mean...
It doesn't affect the truth.
Yes.
Like, the truth is that movie could still be a beautiful work of art, and if you separate from the context, you might know. Now, I think the context is still important. Because it might actually, it might have affected the art. The rapist might have been a bad actor. They might have said some really problematic things in the movie, and once you hear the context, you realize where those came from, right? Or it could be that because of the employees being overworked, that the movie's just literally bad and worse off for the overworked employees, right?
Yeah.
So it can happen, but it's not necessarily the case. And unless you judge the work of art on its own, then you won't ever really know. The other stuff about the author, about the company and the problematic stuff, it's very important to know that because that's extra context to take into effect. Right?
That's true.
It's like trying to figure out what made up a clay statue. What were the motivations behind the author, behind the person who was sculpting it, as opposed to analyzing the shape and form itself.
Because basically you're analyzing the author's motivations and thoughts from the actual work of art.
And you can do the opposite. You can actually choose to support something even though it's complete ethical garbage.
Yeah, you could choose to buy it even though has like bad ethics surrounding it.
Yeah, in which case that's kind of a bad thing. Because you're choosing to support something even knowing that is problematic. And
that could mean that the art itself is bad.
Well, the art could still be good, though. It's kind of unrelated. I mean, not entirely. Like we've said, that the context matters, and that can affect your opinion and your judgment, right? But I just felt we should illustrate that you can support them financially or not, and that doesn't change whether it's a good movie. Even though you're doing this based on the ethical considerations.
Yep, that's true.
But I do still want to underline the fact that if you're choosing not to financially support something because of its problematic beliefs, you're basically choosing to not enjoy what could actually be good art, depending on the situation.
Because of your ideals. And I think that's an admirable thing.
Yeah, it's a noble sacrifice. And I'm not saying that sarcastically at all.
Yeah,
there are many things out there that really should be condemned, even though it might be kind of pretty.
Yeah.
Okay, now that you separate that, you have to also try to separate the author's viewpoints from the art while understanding the connections. Right?
Yes.
Art's kind of like a child. It can inherit its abusive parents' traits, but it can differ.
Yeah, exactly. It can still turn out a lot differently.
Right. Anything else you want to say on that before we move on to the next point?
As saying that that's different from judging the art on its own merit, and if you judge the art on its own merit and it's actually racist or sexist or whatever, then that's bad. Obviously, you could say that's bad art, and that's different from choosing not to participate in the art because of the author.
Right. I feel we should give an example. I know we have examples later on, but let's just do like an easy extreme example, right? How about Hitler's paintings?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Because, yeah, he was a hateful genocidal maniac, right? Mm-hmm. But he painted some paintings. Now, they're kind of universally seen as meh, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not terrible. They're not oozing with hate.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe, I don't know, I can't say this for sure, but it's possible you could be a really good art critic and you could look at the brushstrokes and be like, oh no, you could tell this was angrily painted, like harsh lines and whatnot. So knowing the author and their intent and their motivations might actually help you understand the art itself better. But you're still keeping in mind those are two separate things. Now, if some of those flowers, of the paintings of flowers, had some type of like hateful stuff, genocidal stuff painted into the painting, you could see where that came from and you could condemn both the artist and the art because they both share those views, right? This can be somewhat insidious because you could have maybe the paintings weren't immediately apparent how hateful they are, but it was more subliminal. But in that case, even if it's subliminal, yeah, hate the art. That's messed up. Why would you do that? You ruined that painting of a flower. Come on, Hitler. I didn't expect much of you, but come on, this? Sorry. Okay, that might have been a bad joke. Okay, for the record, Hitler's bad. His paintings were also bleh.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to give this as a extreme example to illustrate this. We have some more realistic examples down the road.
Yeah. All right.
So some more arguments on what we think about death of the author include the idea that basing canonity on IP ownership, intellectual property, is completely ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is. Because, like, whoever owns the IP can't really dictate what's canon or not just because they own it.
Right. I feel like, especially because this is today, right? This didn't matter when it was about individual book authors. But nowadays, when you have entire companies making huge media franchises, multiple games and movies, people will base the idea of like, oh, you can dictate what is and isn't part of this universe based on who currently owns the IP rights.
Yeah.
Like, in what other media does that happen?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, didn't they kill off Sherlock Holmes a long time ago, and then like a fan author wrote him back in to have somehow survived?
As far as I know, yeah.
Yeah.
That happened.
Did anyone go like, oh, well, you're not the rightful IP owner?
No one cared.
But nowadays, that's a really big thing. So, and I think that kind of goes with copyright. Companies are just so trying to hoard their copyright, and they want to craft their own brand image. And I understand that just because you legally have the right to do that doesn't mean you can kind of sweep under the rug some of the stuff that you don't like about your recent purchase.
Companies do that all the time.
I know.
And it's bullshit.
So we want to talk about canon. Canon differs about its scope, right? Because that's what canon really is. When you're asking like, oh, well, what counts? Well, it really depends on how wide a net you're willing to cast. And no one can force that scope on you. The company that currently owns the IP, they can't just tell you like, oh, this is what's real and this is what's not. Everyone needs to decide that for themselves.
Yeah, what's canon or not is a really personal thing to, like, how you feel about the franchise and how you feel about certain works in it.
Right, and because some things can get kind of blurry about their ownership, it really depends on your own personal take on what you want to consider.
Yeah.
So like banned, secret, extended, spin-off, fan, all this type of content, they can all be canon for you.
Exactly.
So, like, for example, there's one big example that kind of covers all of this. This is one of the better examples we came up with. Star Wars.
Yes.
So, some people, they might consider only the original 3 movies made by, what was his name? Lucas?
George Lucas?
George Lucas, yes.
I think.
He worked with a team to create these movies, right? And they were huge successes. You might only look at these original movies as the true Star Wars and consider only these ones canon. That doesn't make it true for everybody else. And it doesn't really matter what the people who made it said or not. You can judge these movies as you feel good or bad, and you can look on the people who created them, Lucas and his team, and that can give you extra context to make your judgment. But it's not the end all be all. Like, even if like George Lucas turned out to be like racist, for example, it wouldn't necessarily affect the movies. They would still be good, maybe, right?
Yeah, the movies themselves.
Unless there was just some secret message in there that once he realized, like he mentions how racist he was, you can go look at it and you're like, oh, wait a minute. All of the droids are disenfranchised. And maybe that could affect, like, maybe it was just something that we literally didn't notice until we had the context.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's a valid interpretation because that's what art is. Art is about interpretation.
Yeah, exactly.
George Lucas then, after his success, created the prequel movies, the next 3 Star Wars movies.
Was he the one that made them, or was it someone else?
It was him.
Okay.
And it was him alone. This time he wasn't working with a team so much. The team was working for him. So he was the big guy in charge. And this isn't necessary to judging the art. Most people can look at these 3 prequels and they can be like, wow, these are not good. That's kind of the consensus you'll find. Like, everyone makes fun of the prequel movies. But you can look at the author for context and you can realize, oh, the reason they're bad is because Lucas had crazy ideas that in the previous 3 movies, his team said, no, we're not doing that. Because he didn't have complete unrestrained creative freedom. Whereas in this one, he got that and he made some really questionable choices.
Yes.
I think most people would question his choice. What was the character, the annoying one that everyone hates?
Jar Jar Binks.
Exactly. I'm not going to make a personal judgment on that. I'm just saying how people feel about it. So some people, because of this, they might want to go, oh, no, I'm only going to consider canon the original 3. I'm not going to consider these prequels that he just went off the rails with. But some people might be like, no, if you want to appreciate the entire Star Wars franchise, you got to include those. So I'm going to include the original 3 and the new 3. And that's your personal canon. Right? You have anything to say, add? Or?
I don't really have that much of an opinion on Star Wars.
I don't really even like Star Wars. Okay, now, but then you have essentially what's called the extended universe of the Star Wars franchise.
Wasn't it like books and stuff?
Yes, most of it was books, but I'm certainly there's other things, games even.
Games.
Like 2D animations.
Games, Star Wars Battlefront 2.
That's more recent, but yes. And all that's considered the extended universe. These are basically other people, authors, companies, other creators that were given permission and license to use the Star Wars name and built upon the universe. And they very much did so. They really fleshed things out. And because a lot of those are good, not all of them, but a lot of them can be, a lot of people love those and they choose to incorporate that into their canon.
Because they're official just by like being about Star Wars.
They were given permission.
Like, expanding on the
And
universe.
certainly they take a cut of the profit. So the extended universe, then you have the 3 original, the 3 prequel, and then the extended universe, right? And then for a long time, that was what the majority consensus was on the Star Wars canon. It was everything. Not everyone. Some people didn't like the extended universe. Most people would never even see it. The mainstream would just be the 6 movies, and that's what was considered Star Wars. So for some people, that was their canon. Now, personally, I'm an appreciator. I'm a lover of art, right?
Yes.
So my take is I always try to consider everything canon. Everything I possibly can, unless it's a direct contradiction.
Yeah.
So, for example, if there was one book where it says that a character lived, and there's another book that was an alternate version where the character died, I can't simultaneously say both of those are real unless I use a cop-out like alternate timelines, which I frequently do.
Yes, because companies care way less about continuity than you do.
Exactly. So I try to do everything I can, at least when I can consider continuity. So for me, I would consider the original 3 movies, the prequel 3, and the extended universe, I would consider all of that Star Wars canon. But not everyone would agree with me.
Yeah, that's true.
And then there's Disney.
Yeah, because they acquired Star Wars.
Because, George Lucas sold the franchise to Disney. And Disney has made some new movies. 3 now, right? 4?
I don't even know.
They're really going crazy with it. And Disney has claimed that the extended universe no longer counts. They've declared that the only things that are canon are the original 3 movies and the new Disney movies.
Yeah,
They don't even care about the prequels. I'm not sure if they're completely disavowed or not, but it's about the original 3 and Disney.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
So this is what we're talking about copyright and IP. If you believe if you're pro canon, then you're gonna think that a lot of people would think that Disney can just declare that this entire extended universe no longer counts. Mm-hmm. How do you have the right to come in here and say this other art is no longer like real?
Yeah, like it doesn't count as Star Wars.
Yes. So I don't buy that, honestly.
Me neither.
I don't think Disney has the right to do that. Now they can make their new movies, and the moment those movies exist, they're art that I also have to consider now. So it's like the lived and not lived situation I proposed to you.
Yeah.
I don't know Star Wars very well, honestly, so I'm certain you can find a specific example. I just don't know of it. But I'm certain that there's been basically a story where when Disney made their 7th movie, right? Mm-hmm. So they made, I think it's actually called Episode 7.
Oh, is it?
I don't know.
Oh no, it's The Force Awakens, isn't it? With Rey and...
Whatever.
We watched it, okay?
No, I didn't. But, no.
Okay.
Anyway, so they had their 7th movie, essentially, and it says, like, what happens to the main character when he gets old, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas that was already written about in the books, and that's not what happened. So you essentially have 2 different futures for the same character. How do you reconcile that?
Oh, yeah.
Disney would have you believe, oh, well, that old one wasn't real. Mm-hmm. It's our new one that's real. The one that we're selling now, I want you to buy. Mm-hmm. Personally, if I was the author, I would try to be consistent and not have logical inconsistencies, right, like that, because that makes it very problem whenever having arguments about canon, right? Mm-hmm. I try to do Occam's razor, alternate timeline.
Yes.
Right? Mm-hmm. Occam's razor is the idea that the simplest solution is usually the right one. It's not always true. It's just a logical argument. Mm-hmm. Because like I said, canon is really depending on what you do. Some people might hate Disney and they might not consider that part of their canon.
Yeah.
Some people might feel the other way. They might love Disney and only consider that and not the extended universe. Either way, I think death of the author is very important. Because if you're taking the author into consideration here as like directly being able to choose what does or doesn't count or having the complete authority over it, then you can't really have this entire discussion.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you don't let the author decide those things because then they can completely discount anything that they just don't like as part of their universe.
Right. I know I went on about that for a while, but I think we've kind of illustrated that. Mm-hmm. Star Wars, I think, is a good example to kind of cover all that stuff.
Yes.
Oh, there's also, fan content, which, of course, the companies would never usually consider as real, but some fans, you might want to include that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so...
It could be very important to some fans.
And that kind of leads us to our next example. Harry Potter versus Rowling.
Okay, yeah, I'll take this one.
Sure.
I never realized how important death of the author was until I looked at the Harry Potter fandom, like, completely divorcing J.K. Rowling as, the god of the Harry Potter universe.
We kind of mentioned this in our Barely Gay Characters episode when she tried to claim that Dumbledore was gay.
Even though it wasn't written about or in the actual series. So that's another part of it, because, can't consider that canon if it's not in the series.
It's not in the story, and she refused to actually put it in there after that point. Even though you're currently making more Harry Potter content, you're unwilling to actually put that in the art itself.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And I think a lot of it was when The Cursed Child came out, the fandom was really upset. Spoilers. Okay. And they were upset because J.K. Rowling chose to pretty much ignore any of the trauma and stuff that happened during the war.
So it's just happy ending?
Kind of, yeah. Basically none of them had PTSD and none of them really had any lasting effects from the war as far as the book was concerned.
So, happily ever after.
So all was well. And I would have preferred her to write, what happened directly after the war. Give me a story where Harry, Ron, and Hermione, can't leave each other alone because they're so, scared and they hang on to each other for nightmares and,
right. And so I think I think the problem you're illustrating there is essentially there was a piece of art that was considered official, right? That was added onto it, where a lot of people might have a consensus that, oh, okay, well, that's part of the canon now, right? However, the piece of art was so bad and failed expectations so thoroughly. I mean, there are many series which suffer from this, which prompts fans to create their own alternate endings.
Yeah, and you know something else? Like, people, it was really out of character for some of them in The Cursed Child. Like, Harry literally tells his son something really mean to him. And it's like, Harry would never say anything bad to his son. Like, he would never do that. He faced so much abuse as a child. He would love his kids unconditionally. Like, we know his character. And also the whole crap about him becoming an Auror. Like, why would he want to make hunting dark wizards his job when he had to basically do that his whole life and deal with that his whole life? A lot of people think he would be happier as a teacher at Hogwarts, you know?
Because they affected him so much in his life. Okay, that's interesting. But I still feel like Death of the Author is really important with Harry Potter because Rowling, as the author, she continuously just kind of spouts things online. And it's nice that she has this whole thing where, like, oh, you can ask the author for, like, world building stuff, right? But the author can be wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
All she can do is give extra context for you to judge the art.
Yeah, and a lot of fan stuff in Harry Potter has become integrated into the fandom. Like, for example, there was this play put on by college kids for Harry Potter, and in the play they say Hufflepuffs are particularly good finders. And anyone who's, like, really into the Harry Potter fandom, like, they don't even recognize that that wasn't in the books.
I don't know what that means.
What do you mean?
Are you saying that Rowling incorporated that into the official works?
No, it wasn't.
So it's fan
official.
content.
Yes, it's fan content, but it got so, like, popularized into the fandom.
That people have just generally come to a consensus on it?
Yes. And that
so it's like a popularly held theory or belief. And an interpretation. You know, that actually happened in the zombies, the Call of Duty Zombies franchise a lot.
Oh, really?
Where people would just kind of believe something and they would later write it into the story. Or even if they didn't write into the story, everyone would just kind of believe it anyway. And so that's how most people would tell the story.
Yep.
So that's interesting. So yeah, okay. One thing I wanted to mention, though, was with Death of the Author, if you as the author write something, like you wrote a bad ending, for example, you might want to revise that. But the way that Death of the Author works is that you actually can't. The only thing you can do is make more art. Because that's all you are. You're not a god. You're just a creator. Right?
And once your art's out there, it's out there.
Exactly. You actually might feel inclined to revise the ending. You do an update. Or if you're like making a game right, you do a patch. And you update your game, your movie, your art, your book, whatever. So maybe Rowling could have like updated and released a new ending. But that would never truly be a new ending. In fact, you now just have two endings. And you have the same problem that Star Wars had. Do you pick the original Cursed Child ending? Or do you pick the new, like, Hogwarts ending? Right? Even though they're both written by the same person. And the person says, like, oh, no, this is the real one. As an interpreter of art, you have to say, no, they're both valid. It's just which one do you choose? And that's why I would just say, alternate timelines or universes or whatever.
Yeah. Honestly, The Cursed Child was so disappointing to people because, like, that was Rowling's chance to, oh, we're finally going to get some more Harry Potter content. We're finally going to get to see what happens to the kids when they go to Hogwarts. And then she just completely ignores their trauma and makes Harry so out of character with what he's gone through. And it's just like, the fandom was really disappointed, and that's why they decided, like, collectively, like, they didn't like J.K. Rowling that much anymore as the god of the series.
Well, she's also said problematic stuff, like Dumbledore being gay, but not willing to actually show that.
Yeah, so I think that's culminated.
I mean, would you describe that as being homophobic?
I don't know. It's kind of just trying to win diversity points. Yeah,
actually, that's a better way of describing it. And that is problematic, right?
Because you're not willing to write it into any of the books or anything, but
Yeah, so if gay representation was like something you're really about, right? Like that was one core philosophy that defines your life. So this author makes that error, that problematic error, right? You, as the person that believes in gay representation, might despise this. You might choose to not financially support Harry Potter anymore. So you're not going to go see the next movie, the one where Dumbledore should be shown as gay but isn't going to be, right?
yeah.
And that would be completely just, and like we said earlier, a noble sacrifice. However, because of death of the author, many fans like yourself can separate the Harry Potter universe from the problematic author, right? You can interpret the art as you will, and you can try to take that context as Dumbledore being gay, but you might even expand your scope of your canon to including fan works where that's overtly shown.
Oh, yes. Actually, something that's written about a lot in the Harry Potter fandom is the fact that so many headcanons and side stories, everyone thinks, well, these could be true because Harry is about as observant as a brick.
I'm not really a fan of the whole headcanon term. I think headcanon really what it comes down to is what we've been talking about is your scope. So I guess the word works because we don't have another one. I won't condemn it. Yeah, like canon is basically the scope of what you're looking at. Headcanon is basically just saying like your personal canon. The reason I don't really like the word is because that's what all canon is.
Yeah.
Right? All canon is headcanon.
Yes. But like a popular thing is like Dean and Seamus Finnegan were in the background as two Gryffindor characters in Harry's year, and they were always best friends. And it's a popular headcanon that they actually got into a relationship during their years at Hogwarts, and Harry just didn't notice. And it's like, that's very believable because we're seeing from Harry's perspective, and he doesn't notice shit.
I guess there can also be like a consensus canon. But usually we don't really come to that as much as we come to what the author dictates as the canon. That's why my personal philosophy and what I consider canon is like, I always just try to do everything. That's why if you ever watched like my videos on YouTube about the BioShock storyline, yeah, I included PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale where Big Daddy fought Sackboy. You got a problem with that? They explained it in the story, Dimensional Travel.
Yeah, that's funny.
It may have been out of nowhere, but whatever.
At least they bothered explaining it.
Well, see, I include everything, even if it's bad. So like with Harry Potter, for example, I would include the Cursed Child in my canon, and I would just personally accept, yeah, it's a terrible ending.
Yeah.
It affects my judgment of the art, but I still going to keep it in my canon.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to some other examples, right? Comedians. Oh, yeah, we got to talk about these. We mentioned it earlier. So like I said, there's been some comedians like Cosby and Louis that have been, convicted of rape or assault, right? Like literally in the courts. At least the first one was.
Yeah.
So that is definitely problematic. And I mean, do you want to give your take on it first, and I'll...
Well, I think you could go back and look at their jokes and see how they viewed women. And that is a very important thing to consider.
Yes, I think if you see that and you don't want to financially support it, I think that is completely understandable. And you are well within your rights to do that.
Yeah.
But if you still wanted to watch it, then you need to determine how the art holds up. So it's possible, it's possible that there are, actually, I don't think it's possible, it's true that you could probably find, the first guy, I don't want to name drop him too much. The first guy was a comedian for a long time, right?
Oh, yes.
I'm certain you could, cherry pick.
I'm sure you could find jokes about him, taking advantage of women.
Well, I was going to say the opposite. I'm sure you could find jokes that are completely innocent. Jokes that are, quite frankly, hilarious. If you pitch them with no context, I might laugh. Right? And you could say in those cases, oh, those jokes don't seem to have been affected by the viewpoint of the author. These jokes hold their own. But then there's other jokes which people, they laughed at, they found acceptable. But then you get this extra context and you're like, oh my goodness, that is not okay. Yeah,
actually people went back and would look at his stuff.
Especially the second guy.
Yeah. would look back and see that stuff and be like, how did people not realize he was doing this?
I think what that really speaks to is that the art was actually bad the whole time.
Yeah.
And it's just now with this context that people are seeing how bad it was.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
I mean, obviously that means I come out on the idea that you really do need to be careful how offensive your jokes go. Because, that's comedians. Comedians are always like on that boundary of what's considered acceptable.
Yeah. And you know what? I think that whole like edgy, like, oh, ha, 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 and you're so triggered stuff is just, it's ridiculous. It's like, it's not funny just to dehumanize people or to get people mad just for the sake of it. Like, you're just an asshole.
I just think people misunderstand, like, there's not just one edge, right? There's pointing out prejudice, and then there's endorsing it, right? So, I mean, you could probably, I'm sure there's minority comedians, right, that point out injustices and stuff, and they laugh about it. And then a lot of these might be jokes where it's kind of commonly accepted that if you're Caucasian, you don't make those jokes. It's not appropriate. Right?
Yes.
And there's a reason for that, because they're pointing out societal injustices. And if you're just kind of joking about it as a Caucasian person, it might come off as like unsympathetic to the things that they're trying to bring to light.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's also possible that you could have comedians regardless of background saying just, racist and offensive stuff. And there can be times when people just accept that, like, oh, that was funny. It was dark humor, right? And then really, it's not okay.
Yeah, it really isn't.
And since comedians are living on these edges, it's possible they could offend, right? It's possible a comedian can have an offensive joke. In my personal opinion, I think they should apologize for that. And they should try to do better with their jokes in the future.
Yeah, I agree.
But nothing that they say and joke about can assuage them from things they've actually done to real people. Right? So yeah, these comedians are terrible, right? And you should condemn them. That's not even a question.
Yeah, exactly.
But their art, I think, should be evaluated and condemned portionally based on the art in question. I think there can still be jokes that they've said that weren't offensive, and there can certainly be ones they said that are. And either way, maybe don't go to any of their shows anymore.
Yeah.
I think it's like, I wouldn't go to one of their shows and financially support that.
Well, you don't ever go to comedy shows, but sure.
And while there are times I can feel that, financially supporting something, even though, like, you don't want to let the author's problematic things get in the way of you enjoying that. So you might want to go buy a CD or whatever anyway, right? The problem with comedians is that it's a one-man show. Or one-person show.
Exactly. It's like their views and stuff this is stuff that they've written, that they've thought of, and it shows their personal viewpoint, and it shows stuff that they've personally been through, because a lot of comedians tell stories about funny things that have happened to them.
Yeah, and honestly, if there was a comedian that exclusively only like did non-personal jokes, because most comedians, they do jokes about their own life, or apparently their own life. If a comedian specifically did only jokes about like a fictional character they made up, right? Like
Jeff Dunham.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
He makes jokes completely with his own characters.
Right. So I'm not going to talk about any of his real characters.
Yes.
But like, let's say he had a character named Fluffy the Elephant, right? The whole character of Fluffy the Elephant might actually be a brilliant masterpiece of comedic art, right? Even if he himself was racist. But because he's racist and it's a one-man show, I would argue at some point Fluffy the Elephant's going to tell a racist joke.
Yes.
And that might be good enough to condemn that art, or at least that joke. Because you got to be careful, if you're going to start splitting apart, are you going to take like a whole movie and because of one problematic scene condemn the whole thing? I think that really depends on personal preference and the art in question.
Yeah, I agree.
I don't think there's like a one right answer to that question.
Yeah, it's really sort of, it's not black and white,
Right. Now, I do know actually some of his characters, which could be offensive.
Oh, yes, I know.
Right. So we were talking hypothetically there, but if we're going to talk about the actual example of that comedian, it's not good.
Yeah, and even characters that aren't on themselves sort of bad, he still makes like homophobic jokes.
Oh, really?
Sometimes.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
So now we were talking about financial support, right? So this brings us to our next example. Oh, actually, before I move on, I just want to say, though, those were just a few examples of comedians. Not all comedians are bad, but there are many people in Hollywood that are. That was the entire point of the Me Too movement, is finding out who those people were. So that movement should be celebrated and continued, period.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving on. Chick-fil-A
Yes.
and Papa John's.
Yes.
Now, these are two foods that I love.
Yes.
Chicken sandwiches are literally my favorite food.
I know. I know.
And we love Chick-fil-A.
Yes.
We love their food. And even Papa John's. Like, okay, people have some really like tense opinions on pizza, and Papa John's gets a lot of hate,
Yes.
especially from places like Chicago or New York or maybe even California, places that have like real like hometown pizza, right? I've never lived at one of those places.
Yeah.
So I like Papa John's pizza. And so the reason people hate it, I think, is because it's so sweet and doughy. I love that. I have such a huge sweet tooth. The more you make my pizza like cake, or a donut, the more I'll love it.
Okay.
I'm not saying Papa John's is my favorite pizza, but I guess I could say it's one of my favorite. Right? So I love their products. So if you consider their products like art, which is, a little debatable, but I feel like products and art can definitely have crossover.
Yeah, definitely.
And culinary art is a thing. So if you consider their products art, then I love it. It's beautiful. Maybe not in health concerns, so it's not perfect. Make the chicken sandwich healthy and I will love you, Chick-fil-A. Well, crap, I shouldn't say that. Because what we're going to say next is that the people in charge of these companies are very problematic.
Yeah.
Like, really problematic. So much so that there are legitimately people that try to boycott Chick-fil-A and Papa John's. And you know what? Great. Good thing that you guys are doing. But it's so hard for me to actually do that because I love Chick-fil-A and Papa John's so much.
Yeah, and it's not like you're punishing the CEO at all. He's still going to get his hundreds of millions every year.
Well, arguably, if everyone boycotted, right, then the company wouldn't make money and it would hurt the CEO.
Yeah, but come on, be realistic. You know that that's not going to happen.
You can at least put a dent in their wallet, though, and that's the point. That's why I'm not going to shame people boycotting that, because I think it's a noble thing.
Yeah, that's good on you, but I'm saying like you're not taking money out of the pocket of the CEO as much as you're also hurting the people that work there.
Well, that is true, but you could argue that if everyone did that, it would be a momentary loss for them, bigger loss for the leader, and it might take down the whole pyramid. And no one would do that if they knew their whole pyramid would collapse. So, I understand what you're saying. You're kind of going from a more realistic, pragmatic thing about what tends to happen, whereas what theoretically would happen if everyone was on board.
Yeah.
So I can understand what you're saying as well as still root for them.
And to be fair, Papa John's fired the problematic guy. So
that is true. Because we never really talked about what their problematic stuff was. But see, the thing is with Chick-fil-A is that their leader is homophobic. He's super religious, which might lead into that. But the problem is that he's homophobic. And then Papa John's, their CEO, their leader, was openly racist and claimed that people kneeling at the NFL, the football players, were disgracing the flag and whatnot when they were actually protesting. So so Papa John's actually protested the protesters and said the original protesters were bad while they were doing good.
And also that claim that they somehow had a problem, messed up their sales or something.
Oh, yeah, because he was specifically saying that the reason for this was that because they, Papa John's has such a football-centric audience, right? They were saying that, this was affecting their stock prices.
Yeah.
Well, after going off some racist rants and using the offensive N-word several times in company meetings, he was let go.
Yeah.
And he still is going to profit off of them because of stocks or something.
Probably.
But immediately after he was let go, the stock shot up. So it was actually him.
That's hilarious.
But I say he's still going to profit off of it. So just because he's gone now doesn't mean, yay, we can eat Papa John's now.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, I mean, I don't eat Papa John's. That's kind of where I drew the line. I do eat at Chick-fil-A, and it's not like I still condemn the leader for being homophobic, but I do take what you said, Kira, into consideration that there are other people working there. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the real reason is I don't have that resolve to resist the Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich. I guess you could say that is a fault of mine, and I do feel kind of guilty every time I do it. I've known vegetarians where they have a cheat day, and anytime I go to Chick-fil-A, that's what that feels like. So I'm just trying to be honest out there. Okay, let's move on.
Yep.
Ender's Game. Did you hear about this?
No, I did not.
It was kind of a similar situation where the person in charge of Ender's Game had homophobic policies. Mm-hmm. And because of that, a lot of people were boycotting the movie. Mm-hmm. Oh, this is not the book. The movie version. And then people were arguing. This was a while ago. So this is one of the first times where I kind of heard this debate going on. This was before I knew about Chick-fil-A and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So people were talking about boycotting the movie because of the founder or the guy in charge of their problematic beliefs. It's about that financial support. And we've really already kind of touched on this, but we just wanted to bring that up as an example. Mm-hmm. Oh, Evangelion.
Yeah.
It's an anime, a really popular one, kind of dark, but it was very controversial because the creator of the anime went on the record and said that anyone who enjoyed the anime was wasting their time.
Really?
Yes. He considered the anime literally to be a product and not art. Wow. And even some people today, like Miyamoto of Nintendo, has this philosophy that their games are products, not art.
Wow.
Yeah. I think that's fundamentally misunderstood. Mm-hmm. That you can't have something be simultaneously a product and art.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I agree with you.
I mean, even like a hammer can be art. Like the way it's curved and its contours and how beautifully it can function.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, imagine if you had never seen a hammer before and you saw one.
I mean, blacksmiths can make art.
Right. Anything can be art, though.
Yeah, exactly.
Even something that's not actually made. It's just natural formations can be art. Mm-hmm. In which case, I guess the death of the author would be referring to God, assuming you believe in one.
Yep.
Anyway, so a lot of people were very hurt by that. And they're like, no, I love this anime. And the author is telling me to hate it. So this, to me, proves you can't rely on who owns the IP to tell you what is or isn't canon. Because this author would tell you that none of it was. That none of it's canon. That it's just a waste of time.
Mm-hmm. Which is ridiculous.
Yeah, so everyone that loved that anime had to decide that their personal canon included the show. That they were going to enjoy it anyway, and they weren't going to listen to the author's personal take.
Yeah.
Now, I already mentioned Treyarch, but I guess this guy goes both for Treyarch and Nintendo.
And Bethesda.
Really?
Yeah, Bethesda, well...
Well, make my point first.
Yeah,
then you can say whether it applies.
Okay.
Where a lot of times video game companies will claim something about their franchise, about the story, the narrative, the characters, something. And then just... everyone, there's a consensus online where they just take it as fact. And I think this is problematic. I don't think a consensus is necessarily right, nor do I think that because a company, an author tells you what's true makes it right. Mm-hmm. Because, like, for example, Treyarch often they literally would troll their audience, where they would just make public announcements that were cryptic and confusing and people would take them as law, right? Mm-hmm. When really, I think they should just be taken as context.
Yeah.
But since they were actively trolling, they would purposefully mislead people just for laughs.
Which is ridiculous that companies have enough power to do that.
I don't even really mind that they did that. I mean, maybe it could be funny. The problem is that people were taking it seriously.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
But you could argue they knew that, so it was abusing their power. Mm-hmm. Now, Nintendo, on the other hand, the thing that made me most angry, they've done this several times, but the one thing I hated that they did is, the Koopalings in the Mario franchise? Mm-hmm. They are Bowser's children. That's what they were designed to be. In Super Mario Bros. 3, they were created to be Bowser's children. He took over the 8 worlds and assigned a world to each of his Koopalings. Mm-hmm. This is reflected in spin-off content, but in actual Super Mario Bros. 3, that's what they were meant to represent.
Yes.
And now he's claiming that, they're not his children. Bowser Jr. is his only child, even though Bowser Jr. was just really portrayed as the youngest child.
Yeah, wow.
Especially now that they decided to bring the Koopalings back into the main series. So really, it's financially motivated. They don't want to get the brand of Bowser Jr. mixed up with the Koopalings. So they've just decided, oh, Koopalings aren't his children anymore. And I'm like, no. If you want me to believe that, put that in the game.
Also, Toad's hat thing.
Oh, yeah. First of all, there are many different Toads. There's one Toad just named Toad, and that's the main Toad. But Toads come in many different colors. There's blue Toad, yellow Toad, green Toad, pink Toad, male Toad, Toadette. So many, right?
Yes.
And so in one of the games, you could play as Mario, Luigi, Blue Toad, and Yellow Toad. Those were two different Toads. They are not the Toad. That's a different character. I know it's confusing naming, Nintendo, but this is your own fault.
Yeah.
Just like you have a Yoshi named Yoshi, right? Anyway, then they had a game where you had Mario, Luigi, Peach, and a Toad that was blue. Well, since Blue Toad was playable in the previous game, naturally it's Blue Toad.
Yeah.
But since there's only one Toad, sometimes they just refer to it as Toad. It's still that's no different than how they don't always call her Princess Peach Toadstool. They just call her Peach.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's Blue Toad, right? But some people just call it Toad. And then they have the whole thing about like the mushroom head, whether it's a hat or a cap. Now Nintendo did comment on this. Do you remember what they said?
I don't remember actually.
I don't even care, to be honest. People ask, "Oh, is it a hat or not?" It's called a cap, right?
Yes.
But that's just the term for it. It's like the cap of a mushroom, okay? It doesn't mean it's literally removable. It's part of their bodies. They are mushroom people. That's what they're called.
Yes. Actually, I think Nintendo's consensus, like in their video, they said it wasn't a hat, but you were still upset about it because they went out and said that this is what's true.
Yeah, if you want to make it the case, then put that in the art somewhere. I mean, I guess you could say their video, but the author can be wrong. Like, for example, if God came down to me, right, and said that the sky was green, I'd be like, yeah, you're wrong. Like, if you really want that to be true, you better make that because it doesn't really match reality.
Yeah, exactly. Because reality is more important than, what someone dictates is true.
You're basically telling me to misinterpret the art because of your own agenda. And I do not appreciate that. And then, okay, so our last example is Ghost in the Shell.
Yes. This was problematic because Scarlett Johansson played what was supposed to be a Japanese woman. Yes. I believe, some kind of Asian.
In the movie version of the movie remake of the anime.
Yes.
Which most people were excited for because you don't get many movie remakes of anime in the West.
Exactly.
Right? And this was a big make or break moment. We could have had so much good anime, and we're not going to get that now.
Yes.
So many good anime-based movies. And the reason is because they whitewashed it.
Yeah, and they did
the movie actually tanked because of that, which is an example that boycotting works, Kira.
Yeah, and fair enough, but it was a movie. And also, it's not a whole franchise. Like, it's not a company.
But it could have been. Well, it is a franchise. It's the Ghost in the Shell franchise.
Yeah, but it's not a company. Like, Papa John's is a company.
It affected whichever company made that movie's bottom line.
Yeah,
whichever executive decided to whitewash that character, they suffered because of it.
They did the same thing in Avatar: The Last Airbender movie, which was widely lauded as one of the worst movies.
Yeah.
But they did the same thing.
Yep. I guess a lot of people probably wouldn't include that in their canon.
Yeah.
That's the alternate timeline we don't like to talk about.
Yes.
Even though it still existed, you can't erase that.
Yeah,
that's important.
I know.
But yeah, Ghost in the Shell, it was so terrible. And it didn't even make sense on a narrative standpoint. Like, you're in Japan, right? And a Japanese city with Japanese people, but this one character is Caucasian? Why? I mean, I get there was android bodies and stuff. Did she specifically request a Caucasian body? And if so, why? Why would you do that?
Well, they made her, so it's possible. I think that's the story anyway.
Well, sort of. But like, my point is, like, it doesn't work on a narrative level.
Yeah, you're right.
Because it was obviously just done for whitewashing. Okay. So my personal take on the death of the author. What counts? Everything. Is the author problematic? Sure, maybe. Is the art problematic? Sure, maybe.
Yeah.
Like, but they don't necessarily correlate. They're not completely disconnected, but they are two different facets of an act of creation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Any other thing else you want to add?
Nope.
Okay, we're really running out on time. Okay, so this has been Game Theorem. Let us know if you have any comments. You can find us at gametheorems@gmail.com. Send in any questions, feedback, or corrections. And then we also have so much social media. It's dying all over the place because of its authors.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.